By Designs, and I'm your host, Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining us on the line today is Dan Sipple, a naturopath, herbalist and nutritionist. And today we're going to be talking about gut inflammation, markers and management. Welcome to Wellness by Designs, Dan. How are you?
Very well, thank you, mate. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wish I was there where you are, down on the south coast of New South Wales. It's a favourite place of mine in the world.
Yes. We're very lucky down here in the south. It's cold in the winter, but the sun's been shining all week, so we can't complain.
Beautiful. Dan, can I start a little bit with your career? What's your background? How did you arrive at an interest in naturopathy and herbalism?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll give you the concise version, Andrew. Otherwise, we'd probably be here all day. But we're sort of going back up, I guess, about 20 years ago now, and I'll sort of do my best to paint the picture. But it was the good old sort of Epstein-Barr virus into never will since scenario for me. So not uncommon, as you know, in our industry. But just definitely that path of illness to kind of discovery and then eventually recovery. So. High school certificate year 12, lots of pressure, HSC and all the things. And I come down with a pretty heavy case of glandular fever at the time. And 2 weeks later, that sort of eventuated, and 2 weeks later, I was back doing my HSC. So it was all quite fast and happened very quickly. But point being, I sort of didn't recover well after that, and for the next 2 years, I was sort of doctor shopping, if you like, and just kept getting told the same old thing that you just need to rest your body. You're still getting over Epstein-Barr, and as I say, it got to about the 2 year later mark by the time I was about 19. And I could just definitely tell that something else was not quite right. Just wasn't thriving. Lots and lots of upper respiratory tract infections, fatigue, brain fog, you name it. But certainly wasn't presenting in a typical way that you would to suspect that there was an underlying gut sort of auto-inflammatory process happening. So I was eventually diagnosed celiac when we changed gears a little bit and saw an integrative doctor. She ran a barrage of tests and found those celiac antibodies quite raised, and so from there it was a big aha moment and a lot of relief, and going down the path of the GI specialist and you need to be on a gluten-free diet for life, and this is how we manage the condition, but you'll do that and life will return to normal. And we'll never hear from you again. Basically, everything will go back to normal within a matter of weeks to months. For me, that was not the case, and I guess over the course of the next few years, kind of worked that out and went on a bit of a journey, because it was recovering from all the damage that I'd taken throughout that period of misdiagnosis, with subsequent antibiotics, just one after the other, boom, boom, boom. So lots of antibiotic cocktails, and by that time in my early 20s, I was quite beat up. So the gluten-free diet definitely helped initially, but I quickly worked out that it was kind of the end of the road with the modern medicine approach as far as celiac recovery and management went. This is where I started learning about gut dysbiosis and the microbiome, and more sort of integrative approaches. So that sort of evolved into a really keen interest, and I worked out by probably the age of 23, 24, that I had a really keen interest in the science side of it, and learning about the autoimmune and gut connection and so forth, and eventually started studying it in my mid-20s. Took up the naturopathic degree through Endeavour, and did that over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, on and off, and was still working at the time. So started practice at the age of 30. I'm 37 now, so this is my 7th year in practice, and we moved down from Sydney down to the south coast when I started. So what's that? Yeah, 7 years ago, and fast forward to 2024, and here we are.
Can I go back to the diagnosis? What
Sure.
was it that that twigged in your doctor's mind to test? Because, you know, you've got that age bracket, you know, the sort of late or sort of mid to late teens. The high school certificate is the classic. The hormones around that era and the stress. So that perfect storm is when EBV just knocks people. But how many get tested and how many don't? So what
exactly
was it
right.
that where your doctor said, listen, we need to test, we need to find out?
I can remember going in. I was still under the care of my folks at the time, and I can remember going in to this particular integrative doctor, who I maintained a great relationship with for years after, and doing the old palpation on the gut. You know, it was probably the first time that my mother was saying, you know, he's not thriving. There was that word, and I was like, what does that even mean? You know, Daniel's not thriving. And it made sense. It was like in all aspects, I just was like I hit a sort of roadblock. And prior to that, mind you, there were no signs or symptoms to alert us to anything celiac related. So I didn't have the classic picture with gut symptoms, and that's probably why it was misdiagnosed for so long. For me, it was more fatigue, brain fog, extreme brain fog. So very cerebral, was a very cerebral picture. Recurrent tonsillitis, which was why probably EBV kept getting blamed, you know, for the illness. And whilst that might have been partially true, the celiac was kind of there, you know, bubbling away in the background. So malabsorption, you know, then ensued. So it was eventually, I had to get really, really low for it to be recognized. So we're talking about, you know, getting to the level of, you know, weight loss, graying of the skin, not leaving the bedroom. Very,
Wow.
very recluse. And so that, I think, tipped the doctor off to the fact that there could be an absorption issue. And that was the first time those antibodies were run. And sure enough, they were sky
Gotcha.
high.
Yeah. So what's really interesting to me is, you know, fatigue in a teenager. Obviously, we think about iron first, but if there's chronically low iron, then you'd go, absorption, celiac. Was there any hint of low iron throughout your earlier years, or any hint of like breathlessness, or, you know, underperforming when you did sports day or anything like that?
The latter, exactly. So where I really knew something was wrong was I was trying, you know, with my limited knowledge at the time to quote unquote get well. So that meant for me lifting weights and trying to, you know, build my body and just build back. But when I do that, I would go catabolic. I would actually break down, and sometimes for weeks. And then I'd come kind of good again, so I'd do it again, and that pattern kept happening. So once again, that's where, you know, I eventually had to just keep pleading with with the oldies. Something is wrong, I'm telling you, and it's not just glandular fever, you know.
Gotcha.
So like I say, I did have to get quite low for the practitioners to think outside the box, and I've always carried that with me, even as a naturopath now, to never. I mean, obviously, I'm biased being a celiac, but to never disregard the importance of running that celiac serology when you're seeing that sort of not thriving picture. And the amount of times we've seen, you know, even low level active antibodies, and you wouldn't otherwise suspect it, then you get your classic cases where it's very, very, you know, true to classic sort of hallmark celiac symptoms.
Yeah. Can I ask you something you just mentioned before, and you said it as if it was inconsequential, but it's got to do with labels. You said, I'm a
Mm,
celiac versus
mm,
someone who has celiac disease.
mm.
Yeah. Do you know that, you know, where the disease becomes the person, if you like? Does that bother you?
It did for a long time. It doesn't now, I
Yeah.
think, because it's been so long. So it's been over half my life, and
Yep.
the awareness now is very, very, you know, different to what it was 20 years ago. So it definitely did for a long time. And it's interesting you bring it up, because sometimes I do say that unknowingly, and it's something that I don't think about anymore. But I often catch patients saying it. You know, and I'll talk to them about that sort of that mindset and changing their terminology. So, um, it's a quite important thing to raise to people that feel that they've, I guess, been, you know, dealt, you know, a bad card, or you know, that sort of victim mindset. Mm.
Yeah. So I guess where I'm going there is, because you're proficient in what you do, you have a level of comfort. It doesn't define you. You're quite fine with it. But for somebody who's investigating this along their journey, they might be a little bit touchy on the subject. Is that how you felt and what you see in your patients?
It was, yeah, yeah. Like I say, for a long time, and I think it's more in the social settings that it becomes quite apparent. At home it doesn't bother you. Quite often, the whole household will just be gluten free, and it's not something
Yep.
that you tend to think much about. But it's sort of those social settings where the rubber meets the road, where you'll be, classic one is you're sitting at a big dining table at a restaurant, you're doing the order, and it gets to you, and all the attention's on you. And you say, can I please have the item on the menu that's marked chef? Oh, and by the way, I'm celiac, can you let the chef know? So
Yeah.
that's where you get reminded. Yeah.
Yeah. But do you find there is a greater awareness now that I mean, we should have had this for at least 10 years minimum, but do you find that there's not awareness, acceptance, indeed care by eating establishments, food establishments that know now about what a celiac is? No, you can't sneak that in. No, it can't have a little bit. It's got to be zero of gluten.
It's
I'm talking
definitely
about.
it's definitely improving. And I always tell people, despite that and the awareness, you got to remember that the waiter takes your order. It then goes to the kitchen, which is a separate area, and that's something that you need to be very confident in. So pick your restaurants wisely, stick to the same
Gotcha.
you know routine, and yeah, you'll avoid trouble. And fortunately for me, it's been, oh gosh, probably over a decade since I've been gluten poisoned. Touch wood.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's go into our topic today because it's quite broad. Um, when we're talking about seeing a patient first for any sort of gut issue, where do you start? Where does the patient journey begin with you? Do you begin with testing? Do you begin with, family history, patient history? Do you start on like a few supplements first before you test? How does it look?
I'd say it's probably different for each patient, Andrew, but I make a very strong point in my intake form, to be very thorough, so that by the time I'm jumping on the call with them, I've got a very well-rounded understanding of where they're at, their family history, their current symptoms. Um, my intake form, probably takes a good 10 to 15 minutes to fill in. So as I say, by the time we jump on the call, I've usually got a whole lot of pathology, not always, but most often as well, to go with it. So that helps me after the initial 45 minutes of questioning to sort of work out, do we jump straight into testing, or has this person already been to 3 or 4 practitioners and they've got a plethora of decent testing, but they're just after a different opinion? In that case, we
Yeah.
usually just jump into treatment. But generally speaking, I do like to start with testing. I feel like it's a good investment. 5 years ago, maybe I would have said something different, but with what we can see of the microbiome and the ecosystem now, I feel like that money is quite well spent. And I always say to the patient, if we don't have the funds to test, that's okay. It's not a prerequisite. But if we can test, I can be very, very specific with the application of different nutraceuticals or prebiotics or probiotics without the guesswork. So it's that whole thing of test and don't guess, I suppose. Mind you, after 7 years and my own personal history, and just being in the health and wellness space for a while, a lot of practitioners would agree you get a pretty good sort of understanding of what tools are very likely to be useful versus others,
Gotcha.
even
So
without
what
testing. Yeah.
tests? Yeah, yeah. So what tests do you tend to favor? What do you employ?
If we're looking at sort of understanding, well, firstly, we've got to understand, is the patient's digestive symptoms in the small bowel or large bowel or both? So in an ideal scenario, if the feasibility isn't an issue, we'll do testing for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth via a series of breath tests, and followed by then the stool test to give us a really good, well-rounded understanding of the ecosystem, where we're not just kind of fixated on looking at pathogens, but we're looking at the balance of the whole ecosystem. And I'm quite in the camp of, yes, we want to understand what critters are in there that are causing dysbiosis and inflammation and so forth. But equally, if not more important, we need to look at the balance of the other guys, which, let's face it, even 10 years ago, we couldn't even see half of what these guys were doing, or didn't know what roles they had. And we can talk about different species that sort of make up that commensal ecosystem as we go. So to answer the question, yeah, if we can do both, we'll get an understanding of where the problems are. Sometimes it's very classic that it is all small bowel, and we'll get a positive breath reading for SIBO. And you'll usually understand that from the interview with the patient, I eat, and it's only half an hour to 45 minutes later that I'll get a lot of symptoms, versus the person that says a lot of my symptoms happen in the PM hours of the day, the back end of the day. I kind of wake up, I go to the bathroom, I do my business. The first half of the day is okay. Later on in the day is when I start getting, quite a lot of signs and symptoms. Yeah, so we can tell, by questioning, we can get a pretty good idea, but ultimately the testing helps us elucidate the specifics.
Gotcha. And so, we're talking about microbial testing. What about other sort of inflammatory markers, for instance, calprotectin? We can go and go. But what do you tend to rely on most, or what do you find is most useful?
The testing I'm currently using, I really love the fact that we understand the species, down to, a really, really definitive level. So what pathobionts and what, commensals are in the gut, but we also have an array of digestive markers and inflammatory markers, like you mentioned, which is very handy. And even 5 years ago, that information was just starting to be sort of, more common to a lot of the different reports that we use, and that's where that information is really helpful for me with patients. So yes, I love to know what species are present in someone's gut. Equally important, as I said earlier, is what the metabolites are, and what sort of what's being produced and what's predominating. So for example, are we seeing lots of hydrogen sulfide gas production? Are we seeing lots of ammonia production? If so, what are the species that are responsible for that, and what can we do about it? And it's really interesting, Andrew, when you interview different patients that are on different types of diets, you can usually tell by their biome reports how they're eating, and by what sort of species are overrepresented or underrepresented. And we can get into the specifics of that. But 2024, it's very popular for people to be on these extreme ends of the diet spectrum. So we can, as I say, we can see a lot from the biome, the impact of that. Whether someone's having issues with breaking down all the protein and the fat that come from a more sort of paleo-esque type of carnivore type of approach, versus someone who's on more of a plant-based diet. Yeah.
Do you ever use a particular food or group of foods as like a challenge to see if a particular forgive me, that the type of bacteria might be sitting there quiescently, and like you said, the patient tends to get symptoms later in the day. You might be seeing them in the morning, but do you ever say, listen, why don't we challenge with this sort of food that you ordinarily have at lunchtime, for instance, that you don't have at breakfast, to see if you can elicit a response with your testing when you do the test? Or actually, no, that doesn't make sense, does it? Because the test is done by the patient at home.
It's interesting. It's a great question. What I often do, Andrew, is I say to them, I paint a bit of a hypothetical scenario, and I say, all right, I want you to envision yourself eating a bowl of chickpeas for lunch today. And you can usually tell by the expression on their face. The folks that might have, the presence of SIBO, they usually say, oh, no, straight away they start shaking their head. No, that's going to be disastrous. I'll know very, very soon if I tried to do that. The last time I happened to do that at, X, Y, and Z was quite disastrous. On the flip side to that, when we've done a lot of, a lot of treatment, and we've put them through various protocols to balance out the ecosystem, one of the foods that I do use as a bit of a proxy are black beans. And I explain to them, these are probably the most gentle out of the legume kingdom. Great prebiotic content. And I say start with a small handful, cook them really, really well, soak them if you can, and see how you react. Give yourself a few days between and then try again. And we just try and build up the tolerance. I've had patients come in that, they've been through all sorts of antibiotic cocktails and told they've had parasites, and it's just kill, kill, kill for years and years, to the point to where they're on literally 4 or 5 foods. And bringing those patients back can be quite challenging. But those usually are the patients where it's just a mess with those metabolites. So we're seeing elevated levels of branched chain amino acids, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, histamine, and a lot of the critters that sort of secrete these metabolites are quite abundant, and it's a slow and steady process with those guys to get them back to normal.
Gotcha. Can we go through some of these metabolites in greater detail? Ammonia, for instance, calprotectin,
Yeah.
but there's others as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. So secretory IgA, I always explain to folks, is an interesting marker that's made in the mucin. It's kind of like the police task force, and we're looking at levels between sort of 500 to 2,000 micrograms per gram as being sort of the normal range. If we see it quite low and underneath and underrepresented, it's kind of that immune depletion picture. And you do see that. It's probably rarer that you see that. Quite often, what I'm seeing more commonly is the elevated presence of secretory IgA, and when we see that, we're usually correlating that with a dysbiotic picture or an autoinflammatory picture. So the task force are just on high alert. Essentially, that's how I explain it to people. In line with that, fecal calprotectin is a great marker. That's the one that mainstream GI specialists will often use to look at IBD patients and measure different interventions in pharmaceuticals and whatnot to see if it's active or in remission. But as naturopaths, again, that's kind of a great marker that we can utilize to look at whether people are kind of in the clear for very full-on inflammation, or they're in that borderline kind of area, which is, I think, around 50 to 100. So when there's that borderline result, sometimes it is useful to send them off to a GI specialist for an opinion. Certainly when it's over 100, we're doing that regardless of what we're doing as naturopaths to explore the underlying cause there. Typically, that's usually down to a sort of autoinflammatory IBD kind of case where there is very overt inflammation. But even then, as naturopaths, I like to think that there's a lot of nutraceutical tools that we can use to intervene or add as adjunctive therapies there to help drive that down. And I've seen that quite commonly, even with just good old curcumin at the right dose.
And Dan, what about ammonia, for instance?
Yeah, ammonia is an interesting one. It's an emerging metabolite, and I always sort of make a point when I get a patient through that is on a more, athletic diet, carnivorous diet, paleo sort of diet, however you want to refer to it, but a diet essentially where there's not much of that fermentable carbohydrates coming in, and it is quite protein and fat heavy, which can be great short term for metabolic reasons, but long term for the microbiome can start to tip the balance. And this is where branched chain amino acids, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide and histamine, come to think of it, the 4 of those can be quite elevated. And it's an interesting one because the patient doesn't necessarily have a whole heap of gut symptoms always in that case, and it can be quite different. And what I mean by that is, for some people, high ammonia can just mean brain fog. For another person, it can be chronic fatigue. For another person, it can be achy joints. And so that sort of highlights the importance about looking at these metabolites and understanding that the microbiota isn't just simply, the composition of what species make it. It's how your diet is interacting with those species and then what compounds they're producing. And I always explain to patients, those compounds that they're producing can either be anti-inflammatory and driving your health, or pro-inflammatory and degrading your health. And of course, there's always going to be a balance. It's an ecosystem after all, with hundreds and hundreds of species. But looking at that data is quite valuable. I've said it already on the podcast today, but even 5 years ago, we weren't able to see much of that in terms of the metabolites produced, and therefore it was more just focusing on what species were present and whether we had enough good guys and quote unquote bad guys and a balance. But I do use that data when I follow up and do another repeat test, which I usually recommend either 6 to 12 months later if the budget's there, and it's really interesting to see what interventions work to balance that out.
Great. Anything else that we need to be aware of with regards to the metabolites? Because these are interesting to me, really interesting.
The other one is hexa LPS, so lipopolysaccharide, and
Right.
it's the citrobacters and the E. coli's and Klebsiellas and these types of pathobionts that when they get too high make this thing called endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, and it's not something where the bugs are trying to harm us. It's just how our immune system surveys them, and in response to them, if they're too high, will produce more inflammatory compounds as a result. But elevations of these pathobionts is, typically what we see drive the sort of Western dysbiotic gut. And then from there, you can then argue, we're seeing offshoots to various disease risk conditions such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's, and a plethora of other conditions that wouldn't ever been linked to the gut microbiome 10, 15 years ago even. So it's quite exciting to see that sort of space, evolve.
Can I ask you, with people who are neurodivergent, for instance, they tend to have an overabundance of the Clostridiaceae. Are there any things that we need to be aware of apart from identifying that overabundance? For instance, metabolites, particular metabolites they may throw out. Is there anything that we need to be aware of with regards to these people who have these conditions and their gut scenario, if you like, but also how we intercede with them? That's a bit of a broadsword, that question, isn't it? What can we see if we did testing on neurodivergent people? Is it plain as day or is it nuanced?
When you ask that, I think straight away back to a case I saw about a year ago, which was an autism case, and I don't treat that presentation, clinically often. It has, obviously cropped up over the years a couple of times, but it's certainly not my area of specialty. But I do recall when we did shotgun metagenomics testing on this particular case, I think it was the Prevotella species or the E. coli was making on its own, I think, almost half of the microbiome. So the abundance of that species or
Wow.
that genus was that represented, which was the highest I've ever seen. I'm not aware of, whether that's a classic finding for that sort of, neuroarchetype, but I just remember thinking that is very significant, and it's quite likely that is adding, a large degree of, what would you call it, influence on how that sort of condition plays out.
Gotcha. Any other metabolites that we need to be aware of?
The only other one I think about is mucin degradation, and that's again a
Of
newer
course.
sort of kid on the block. But
Yep.
the gut, obviously, as we know, makes mucus. It sows and reaps mucus, and there needs to be a good turnover and balance of that for protective reasons. But when there is a lack of that fermentable fiber, the critters in the biome will go to that as a fuel source and thin the gut wall, and then therefore make the walls of the gut in the large intestine more thin and leaky. And as we know, leaky gut is kind of and permeability is a precursor to a lot of these Western type of conditions that we're seeing massive amounts of. So I think that does come back to the conversation about fiber, but then it's from there, it's like fiber isn't just the one thing. It comes in all different shapes and sizes, as one of my mentors, Jason Horolac, likes to quote all the time. And it's so true. I use that often in consults even today, get people thinking about, away from thinking that fiber is just this thing that comes in cereal, which we all grew up in the 80s and 90s thinking of, the Kellogg's fiber,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that, thinking about polyphenols and blacks and purples and blues and the colors of the different skins on various fruit and veg, as microbiome feeders. So that's getting back to the 40 plants a week, 50 plants a week type of conversation. And I always make a point to say, I'm so not a practitioner who is more plant geared. I believe in the power of animal protein as well, but there just needs to be a good balance of both at the end of the day.
So that was going to be my next question. It's sort of, we always talk about when we're talking about good bacteria, feeding good bacteria, it is always and only plant food. But there is a balance. We are omnivores. Sorry, vegans. I'm going to get lambasted, I know. but if we're talking that, then surely a balance, there's obviously that critical balance, but surely bacteria that are fed by meat, proteins, and fats are not in and of themselves bad. It's just this abundance. Correct?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I mean, the reality is that in non-civilized, non-Western nations, hunter-gatherer societies, when they looked at the biomes of these people, who, by the way, when they make a kill, are going to gorge on animal protein and preference it. Yes. That said, they're not going to make kills every day and have meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that comes back to the conversation about, well, there's these fallback foods, which are the plant foods and the tubers and the berries and the nuts and seeds and that sort of thing. So if we try and reflect that, which I look at everything through an evolutionary lens when it comes to health, that makes sense that the diet ideally is somewhere between, perhaps 60 to 70% plant fibers versus that 30% of animal proteins.
Yeah. Yeah. I often describe to people who are wanting to investigate the paleo diet and they think it's all protein. I say, hang on. Cavemen didn't eat mammoths along the way to killing the mammoth. The mammoth was the prize at the end of it, but along the way they had to eat tubers and berries and nuts, things like that. That
Sometimes
sustained
for
them.
days on end.
Lauren Cordain, in fact, when he presented at a symposium, who was it? Pete Evans. Pete Evans begged to provide to do the menu for that symposium. And when you go out there to lunch, it was largely plant food, absolutely spectacular plant food with some, obviously generous amounts of meat. But I wonder if part of the issue these days is not so much what we're eating, but how much.
How much we're eating, how changed it is from its natural state when it's harvested, how it's stored, where it's traveled from, what's added to it. Yeah, all of those things for sure. And the abundance, the intake.
Yeah. Which is obviously my demise. But anyway, Dan, can we go into a little bit more depth about what you use with most merit? You've spoken about curcumin previously. If we're talking about gut inflammation, you've got classic things like fish oil, for instance, but even things like food. Like I've been keenly interested in these for years, and forgive me for rabbiting on about them, but they're called PDENs now. So plant-derived exosomal-like nanoparticles, right? PDENs. And the original one that I investigated was ginger. So back then it was ginger exosome-like nanoparticles, or GELNs. What basically the message is that the ginger plant, when we eat it, they bud off this little vesicles, packages that contains RNA. That RNA talks to the bacteria, the genes in the bacteria. The genes in the bacteria then talk to the genes of the human to say, settle the hell down. It was really interesting. Although that was a mouse study, they're now investigating these plant-derived exosome-like nanoparticles, PDENs, for drug delivery. And what they found was that they dampened inflammation. They made an anti-inflammatory medication safer and more efficacious. I'm keenly interested in this. So you mentioned before about Jason Horolak talking to you that fibre isn't just the cereal fibre, that it's in a heck of a lot of other foods. Do you find that you select certain foods to elicit certain responses at all? Like you mentioned, endotoxins, LPS?
Yeah. So look, I'm one of those practitioners where I like to use a combination of obviously diet and the medicines, but I always try and place more emphasis on what they can do in the diet, because not everyone I should say, but most people are very much geared towards what's the latest and greatest, what's the silver bullet. But I always say to people,
Yep.
when it comes to microbiome resolution or balance, there's so much that you can achieve with just dietary changes. And it's actually the doing part where people fall down. So the education can be there to the cows come home. I've got all these charts of here's your black foods, here's your red foods, here's your purple foods. When you're doing your shopping, just simply try and add more, and just work your way up slowly. But being conscious of that on a day-to-day basis and then being consistent with that is the challenging part. But for the folks that do it, we can see massive changes in diversity, for example, in the gut microbiota. But to answer your question specifically, one of my favorites, and again, I have to thank Jason Horolac, the Big Mac Horolac, as I like to call him, for this one, but it's the pomegranate peel. So the peels of the pomegranate. And
Yep.
there was even a time where I actually, broke them down and got a big delivery of these beautiful biodynamic pomegranates, saved all the peels, cut them up, put them in the blender, dehydrated them, and I went through two, huge tubs. It took me about 2 years to get through them, mind you, but not everyone has to go to that length, but you can purchase that online, quite easily. So that's one example. The black beans, which we already mentioned, and I think it comes down as well to saying, hey, that sweet potato you eat, try and get the purple version. Hey, that rice that you
Purple,
have
yeah.
3 or 4 times a week, try and get the black and red version as well. And you just get them thinking like that, just to diversify the color palette coming in, and the effects are quite good. Another one is the EGCG from green tea. Such a basic thing that, just getting people sold on, if you just have a very strong cup or two daily of green tea, that goes a long way. Not even just with the biome, but outside of the biome. So those are my favorites from the sort of culinary dietary perspective. In terms of the nutraceuticals, I'm very jazzed and excited about the non-dairy serum derived immunoglobulins.
Oh, yeah.
The people that come through that are dairy sensitive, that their faces light up when you talk to them about a dairy-free
Yep.
colostrum alternative, and it works wonders. I've seen great results before and after with leaky gut testing, using the lactulose mannitol test, and just in those patients like we're talking about earlier, like myself a long time ago, that are just not thriving, that just have a really beat up gut, and you're pretty sold on the gut permeability as a core factor there. Such a great gentle additional tool. In addition to that, again, something I'm playing around with more and more these days is the human milk oligosaccharides, 2FL or 2-fucosal lactose, which is
Yeah.
naturally occurring in mother's milk, using more and more of that. In the prebiotic kingdom, which I do more and more of once again, and it's not that I don't use probiotics still, but I kind of have a limited range of single strain probiotics that I kind of stick to. I could probably count them on one hand, but outside of that, it's more about the prebiotics. Inulin is one of the favorite for the folks that can tolerate it. And coming back to those markers we were talking about earlier, Andrew, great for attenuating that calprotectin, even when that's borderline or raised. Does a great job. Secretory IgA, when that's elevated, there's good research with galacto-oligosaccharides, or GOS. Partially hydrolyzed guar gum is another favorite, and that's the one that I usually go in with prior to knowing what the biome looks like. Irrespective of that, we say, get your sample sent off, and regardless of what comes in, let's just get you started on this guar gum stuff, and we'll just start you off nice and slow and gentle.
Can I ask about tolerability? So patient compliance, I guess we're talking about here. But when we're talking about some of these fibres, like for instance, banana fibre, there's a sugarcane fibre, really hard to mix. They're hygroscopic. They float on top, and as soon as you put the spoon in, they go poof. So
Yeah.
with regards to patient compliance, do you ever talk to them about, listen, this is how you take this sort of fibre, whether mixing it in with a food or indeed, no, mixing it in with a food on their plate or mixing it in with a condiment, like for instance, applesauce or something like that.
Yeah,
Do you ever employ these
yeah, I do.
tactics?
Absolutely. The first one that comes to mind, and I happen to have it right here in front of me for those folks watching, is the inulin. And the cell that I say is it tastes like fairy floss, and it actually does. And that's what I say to the mums and the dads for the kids that I see. You can literally get them to just spoon it straight into their mouth, and it doesn't necessarily require that water, although it can go in water. But the compliance has been great with that. You can just get it straight into the mouth, and it's got that really nice, naturally occurring sweetness. Um, so inulin is great for that. With the guar gum, I usually say that's quite seamless, so it'll go into everything. To your point, the resistant starch, that's a harder one, a trickier one. So smoothies are great. If we can get the patients doing 3 or 4 smoothies a week and get a generous dose of the RS in there, which is a prebiotic that you can go quite high with, or you get quite better outcomes, I find, when you go like more around the sort of 10 to 15 gram mark, even for some folks. And with some of those patients, it's important to note too that sometimes with prebiotics, the needle doesn't move until you get up to those sort of levels, and that's something that over time I've had to get really comfortable with, and sort of go out on a bit of a limb. So 3 or 4 years ago, it might have been, let's just start you on 5 grams or a teaspoon, and just kind of leave you there for weeks to months and see what changes. As patients come back and say that they're tolerating it, though, I'm each time now getting them to up it and push the envelope to that level, to just below where there might be a bit of discomfort. And for some patients, it's almost like they just turn a corner at that 10-gram mark with inulin or partially hydrolyzed guar gum. It's quite interesting.
Right. I know this is going to be a multi-pronged question, forgive me, but with regards to other things that you might employ, if we're talking about healing an inflamed gut, you've got things like zinc, obviously. You've got the zinc carnosine, for instance, which has its own action with healing lesions, let's say. We've got to think about even, liver herbs, for instance, helping with digestion, with bile flow. And then the second, sorry about this double prong thing,
Hmm.
is if we think about the effect of stress on the gut,
Yeah.
and we think
Yeah.
about how it can be deleterious to healing the gut, how much do you employ, let's say, anti-stress herbs or the nervines, the adaptogens, in helping somebody to cope with the stressors of life while they're healing their gut?
I'm glad you asked.
Oh, okay,
It's
great. I
huge,
thought you
that
were going to
point.
hate me.
Not at all, not at all. Because it's one of those things that it's very easy to overlook. Mindfulness, nervous system balance, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. The role of the vagus nerve between the brain and the gut. Which over the years I always think of your conversations with Mark Donahoe, that you guys have talked about that ad nauseum, and it's so true. That the power of the vagus nerve, and what the nervous system can influence in these cases. That was very, very like specific to my healing too, Andrew. So there were periods when I think back to my journey where I'd come good, and then I'd get poorly again, and then come good. And if I had have known about the nervous system back then, I think I could have done a lot more. Very easy to say now in hindsight, but just the power of various healing modalities, even just walking in nature 20 minutes a day, something so simple, the breath
Yep.
work. And I'm sure we're preaching to the choir when we go on about this, but I concur 100%. The amount that we can achieve just by the mindfulness and these sorts of parasympathetic practices, equally important as just the medicines that they're recommending too.
Sure. You mentioned retesting earlier. Can you just give us a little thing about the benefits of managing somebody's symptomatology, tracking their progress of therapy versus the cost of therapy? How do you sit?
Yeah, so it's something that I don't entertain. Like if someone says, "Oh, Dan, I want to jump back in there and have a look at what we're doing and see if it's changed," I say, "Listen, we can do that. It's probably not worth doing that in terms of the financial outlay until about the 6 month mark. Realistically, and that might differ from patient to patient slightly. But how I sort of approach that conversation, I suppose, is I say, although it is quite a big investment, doing that retesting at the 6 month mark or the 9 month mark, that might allow us to cut down your supplement intake by half. So then it's like you work out what you're paying in supplements, whether there's 6 or 7 things that we started with, we might only need 2 of them. But
That's right.
ultimately using your presentation along with the results will ultimately guide us there. And I will usually preface that when we do the first round of testing by planting that seed and say, now this is good data, we've got a benchmark now, let's earmark it for 6 months that we do another test.
Dan, I have to ask, where can we learn more? Do you have any e-courses or anything like that that you provide to practitioners or even patients at all to learn from?
It's funny you ask. I'm actually in the process of putting slowly together an online autoimmune masterclass, and that's something that's
Okay,
that's been
great.
on the mind for years. So it's taken me a while to get into action, but yeah, I plan later this year, early next year to put that out. So my main sort of online presence is through Instagram. That's where you can find me and reach out. And yeah, practicing still Monday to Friday. I do my four patients a day with gaps in between, and just keep it at that.
Yep.
And that's how we tend to manage it. But yeah, so look out for that to come out online, and also the website functionalnaturopath.com.
Love it. Dan, we could learn so much more from you. Thank you so much for taking us through gut inflammation markers and management today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good to chat to you, Andrew.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Remember, you can catch up on the show notes for this podcast, and they will be lots, plus all the other podcasts on the Designs for Health website. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. This is Wellness by Designs.